All right, welcome back. In this section, we're going to talk about some really important built-in React methods called lifecycle methods. We'll use them all the time. First, a quick rundown of the goals. We want to understand what component lifecycle is, what it looks like, what order things happen in. And then talk about the different methods for mounting, updating, and unmounting different stages of a component life cycle. And then we'll briefly talk about some of the less commonly used lifecycle methods. There's a few kind of weird ones that don't come up often. I'm just going to devote a video to all of them, just combine them together. All right, so let's start with lifecycle in general. Every component comes with a couple of methods that allow us to update application state or reflect changes to the UI before and sometimes after key React events. Now, when I say React events in quotes, I don't mean like DOM events, clicking, dragging, not that sort of thing. I'm talking about events or stages in the lifecycle of a component. So there are three main phases we need to know about. Every time we have a new component and we're rendering it, let's say we're adding it to the app.js, there are three stages. Something called mounting, which we'll talk about in this video, and then updating, and then unmounting. So let's begin with mounting. So when we render a component like this timer component, it doesn't matter what it does, what it looks like for this example, but once we tell React, put a timer on the page here, what happens? Well, the very first thing is that it runs the constructor. So we use the constructor, we've been using it all the time to initialize our initial state, to set the values that we start out with in the state, and to bind event handlers. So things like this, setting our initial state, binding something like handle click, we do this all the time. So this is going to run first. And then afterwards, our good friend render. So after the constructor, React calls render, and we know this, the point of render is that it tells React what should be displayed. So React then goes and updates the DOM to match the output of render. Then what happens? Well, if we look at this handy dandy chart, this is included in the documentation. There's a link. Focus on this left side, mounting. So constructor, we've already talked about that. After the constructor is run and called, we go to render. After render, React knows how to update the DOM. Put an H1 here, put a div over here, and it does that. And then afterwards, we have a method we haven't talked about, ComponentDidMount. So that's what we're going to focus on in this video. ComponentDidMount is a lifecycle method that we can define, and React will automatically run it for us once as the component has mounted. So after the constructor, after the render, the first render, because often components are re-rendered over and over and over, but after the very first time it's rendered, something appears in the DOM, then whatever we put in ComponentDidMount will run. Back to the slides. This method runs after the component is mounted. All right, repeating myself a bit. Mounting just refers to the first time the component shows up in the DOM. So render is called for the first time. React knows, okay, we need to put an H1 and a div and a form. Then it mounts that component, renders it to the DOM, and then ComponentDidMount is called. So it's a good place to load data from Ajax, to set up subscriptions, timers. I'll show you an example of loading Ajax data in the next video, but for now we're going to focus on a little timing example similar to what they do in the documentation. Also, you should know that if you do set state, if you call this.setState inside of ComponentDidMount, it does trigger a re-render because, as we've already seen, by the time we get to ComponentDidMount, render has already been called once. So if you're setting the state in here, it's going to render again. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That doesn't mean you shouldn't call setState. A lot of what we do in ComponentDidMount involves setState. Just know that this does not occur before the first render. It happens afterwards. So if you change the state, like anywhere else when you set the state, it will trigger a re-render. So here's an example. Let's start a timer when a clock or a timer instance, a component, is first rendered to the DOM. So instead of starting it in the constructor, where the timer might not actually be showing up in the DOM, we can start it in ComponentDidMount, and it would look something like this. ComponentDidMount, and then we define some code. So I'm going to show you an example now. Here is a timer component, and I'm going to begin inside of my component by defining a constructor. And we're not really going to do anything in this constructor for now, but let's just do super props and then console.log in constructor. And then we have our render. So let's console.log in render. And then finally, let's add in that method ComponentDidMount. And we'll simply console.log ComponentDidMount, or let's say in ComponentDidMount. Okay, so I'm exporting timer. I've imported it over here. I'm rendering a single timer inside the app. Now if we come over here, we should see in constructor happens first, then in render, and then in ComponentDidMount. Now if I change something to trigger a re-render, which I guess there's not much I can do because there's nothing in the state. So let's go and add something to the state inside of the constructor. So right here, we'll do this dot state equals, and let's just make something called test and set it to 1. If I come back, we'll see the same thing. Constructor happens first, then render, then ComponentDidMount. But now if I tweak that state, which is right here, and if I set test to be 45 instead, and we go back to the console, you'll see we don't call the constructor again. That happens one time. We don't call ComponentDidMount, or I shouldn't say we don't call it. It is not called by React, but render is called again. So after the very first render, ComponentDidMount runs, but after every subsequent render call, which often there's a ton of them if your data is changing frequently, there aren't any more ComponentDidMounts. It runs one time at the beginning, after the initial very first render. There are other things we'll talk about in a couple videos from now that have to do with updating data, and those are called after subsequent renders. But ComponentDidMount runs once at the beginning, after the component mounts, after the constructor, after the first render, then ComponentDidMount. So this timer component will be very simple. I just want a little clock that updates the number of seconds since the component has been on the page. So I'm going to make something called time and set it in the state to be new date. And then down here, instead of timer, I'm going to just add in this dot state dot time dot get seconds. And when the page initially loads, we'll see 57 seconds. So what I want to do is update the state every 1 second, every 1000 milliseconds, and make it a new date, the current date. And then this should render automatically and update every 1 second. So the standardized place to do this, and we'll talk more about why this is standard inside of the next video, but we're going to do it in ComponentDidMount. Okay, so I have a set interval, and every 1000 seconds or milliseconds, we're going to call this dot set state and pass in, let's do time is set to new date again. And I am saving, I'm capturing timer ID so that I can stop the timer later on in a future video. So we don't have to do that right now. So ComponentDidMount will run once. We'll set this interval, which will keep running forever as of now. Every 1 second, we're updating time in the state and making it a new date. And then in our render, we're simply getting the current seconds from whatever time is and then displaying it. So whenever we call set state, this will be updated. Okay, and here we go. So I'll refresh, 38, 39. So this isn't the number of seconds since the page has been loaded. This is the number of seconds from a clock. So like right now, whatever time it is, 11:26 and 51 seconds. That's fine. It doesn't really matter for this example. But we can see that render is being called over and over and over, but ComponentDidMount was only called one time. All right, so in the next video, we'll talk more about why you would put code like this inside of ComponentDidMount instead of in the constructor, because that could work. It seems like a nice place to do it. You want to start the timer right away, but we'll chat about it in the next video. We'll talk about Ajax as well.